If there's one thing I can say about this, is that it's always a pretty consistently engaging experience, and it's never emotionally hollow. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel and a brand new review series, though one that I'm doing a bit differently than my normal review series. Later in the year, we're getting the final film in the Halloween 2018 reboot trilogy, Halloween Ends, and I'd love to be able to talk about all the Halloween movies in the lead up to it. But with there being 11 movies I've yet to review on this channel, I can't do all that on top of new releases in the fall, which I'm sure will be a busy time of year for movies as per usual. So instead of doing them all in one shot, instead, every month I'll be reviewing one of the Halloween movies in the lead up to Halloween Ends. Though since there are 11 I haven't talked about, there will be one month where I'll double up, but I'm not sure which one that'll be yet. But once we get to Halloween Ends and I've reviewed every single movie, it'll then be followed by a ranking video. So, we're kicking things off with the one that started it all, 1978's Halloween. But before we get into all that, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on Halloween were, if you already saw it, or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's not waste any more time and let's talk about Halloween. This follows Michael Myers, who, 15 years after murdering his sister on Halloween night in 1963, escapes from a mental hospital and returns to the small town of Haddonfield, Illinois, to kill again. So as I typically do with other review series, this will get into spoiler territory. So if you haven't seen Halloween by now and you wish to know absolutely nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Go watch the movie, then come back to this. But now that you've been warned, here we go. This is the only Halloween movie directed by the legendary John Carpenter, with it being his third feature film. And honestly, I feel like this film really doesn't need that much of an introduction, given how iconic it's become and for how heavy of an influence it had on the slasher genre. Movies like Psycho and Black Christmas started pushing those boundaries a bit as far as what could be done in a horror movie and still be compelling, but Halloween essentially kicked off what's known as the golden age of slasher movies. 80s films like A Nightmare on Elm Street, The Slumber Party Massacre, My Bloody Valentine, and probably most notably, Friday the 13th were all directly influenced by Halloween. And I say most notably in regards to the latter movie because I always felt it essentially just plays like Halloween in the woods. And when it comes to not only some of the greatest slashers of all time, but some of the greatest horror movies of all time in general, Halloween's almost always somewhere towards the top of the list. You usually see it at number 1 on a lot of best slasher movies of all time lists, and it'll hover somewhere towards the top of just overall best horror movies of all time. Maybe not always in the top 5 or anything, but it's up there. And it's not hard to see why. It's an effective movie for a number of reasons, primarily through Carpenter's direction, the iconic score, the presence of Myers himself, as well as the themes it examines. I wouldn't necessarily call this the most thought-provoking horror movie of all time. Like, I wouldn't put this on the level of that elevated horror as it's been coined in the new Scream movie or anything, but it's not just made up of mindless thrills. This is instead an examination of the notion of pure evil, because typically there's a motive in these movies. Most iconic villains, whether they be horror or non-horror villains, there's always some reason for why they do what they do. Not when it comes to Michael Myers, though. He doesn't speak, he doesn't necessarily think things through, we don't know why he does what he does. He's just this large, looming figure who stalks people, mainly teenage girls, in this small neighborhood and does it just because. Now, there have been debates regarding the true nature of Michael's motivations, with, at least at the time, some seeing Michael primarily stalking teenage girls who have sex as some sort of morality play, but Carpenter has gone on record to distance himself from that, having even said that's completely missing the point. The general motivations for Michael, even as said by Dr. Loomis, is that he's just pure evil. Nothing more, nothing less. And while if done the wrong way, it can make for a boring character, if done right, it's arguably more terrifying, because these types of characters are completely unpredictable. You have characters like, say, Jigsaw or Freddy Krueger or whoever, and even if they're completely off the rails themselves, there's always some internal logic for them. There's always some rhyme or reason for why they do what they do, as warped as it may be. There's no logic with Michael Myers, though. There's no reasoning with him, there's no trying to talk sense into him, he doesn't give you a reason for why he does what he does, especially since we don't hear him talk. He's just evil, and if you're within his line of sight, you need to get out of there like 10 minutes ago. He is simply the boogeyman, which is how he's referred to by multiple characters here.
What's the boogeyman?
As a matter of fact,
It was.
And what makes him more terrifying, at least here before he later becomes known as this almost supernatural being, is that he's just a guy. While latter movies lean towards something that has you questioning whether or not he's immortal or something, here he's just a large, hulking man in a mask walking around who somehow can't be killed. While his seemingly superhuman durability is certainly tested, the fact it's just a guy in a mask, something grounded much more to reality than, say, a Freddy Krueger or a Chucky or whoever, gives this a lot more of a realistic feel, and in essence makes it a lot more terrifying. And the scenes of Michael walking through Haddonfield and wreaking havoc are terrifying, but not for the reasons you'd think they would be, at least if you're watching it for the first time. Slasher movies in general are known for how unbelievably violent they can be. They're incredibly bloody, with a lot of characters meeting these brutal ends, and in some cases can be really uncomfortable to watch. But Halloween is actually not all that bloody or gory. It gets grouped in with a lot of these bloodier slashers by default, but when you take a step back and think about it, it's actually pretty tame compared to the movies it inspired. Even though Michael's known for walking around with that butcher knife, there's only one sequence where he uses it for this gruesome death, which is the opening scene where he kills his sister Judith, arguably the film's most famous scene, especially for the unsettling way it presents a sequence through a killer's point of view, which was something rarely seen until that point. But this isn't a slasher that has a really high body count, and the few we do get, one's done in the dark where we really can't see any of the blood, and two involve Michael strangling people. So this isn't as gruesome or as bloody of a film as most other films commonly associated with the genre. Instead, the technical achievements are what makes this unsettling. For one thing, Carpenter's score is iconic, and you know when you hear that theme music that something bad is about to go down. It's used a lot here, and it's far from one of the more subtle sounding scores, but it's incredible how effective it is at immediately shifting the mood of the scene so that it has you already on edge. And beyond that, it's Carpenter's direction in general that also brings that sense of dread. This excels on a technical level for the way Carpenter plays with foregrounds and backgrounds. There will be moments where we see Michael from afar, or he's this blur in the background, and that's where a lot of the terror comes from. I've said this before, but a lot of good horror doesn't necessarily stem from what we do see. It's not always about how gruesome or how out there you can look. It's usually a lot of what's implied or what's not seen, or what's hinted at coming, or what's possibly coming. That's the sort of stuff that really leaves you on edge and sends a chill down your spine. Like, there's a great scene later on in the movie where Laurie Strode is crying against a wall, and right next to her is this dark room where Michael's face slowly comes into focus, and he eventually does attack her in that sequence, but the moment of his face slowly coming into focus is easily the most terrifying part of the scene, not when he actually attacks. And speaking of, let's get to our protagonists. This gave us two iconic horror protagonists. One is, of course, Laurie Strode, played by Jamie Lee Curtis, who's now known as one of the most famous final girls in horror history, arguably the most famous, and she's especially known in this film for embodying many of the quote-unquote horror rules that films like Scream would later satirize, and it should be noted that Scream was most influenced by Halloween. But she doesn't have sex, she doesn't do drugs, she plays things pretty safe. In fact, what's interesting is, she plays things so safe that she doesn't even truly realize the danger she's in till about an hour and 15 minutes into the movie. And this is a 90-minute movie with credits. While she briefly sees Michael a couple of times early on, when he appears and then quickly disappears, she doesn't think much of it, though those scenes are pretty eerie, to be clear. But when it gets to Halloween night, she's fairly disconnected from everything else that's happening for much of the film. Michael's instead attacking her friends Linda and Annie, played respectively by PJ Soles and Nancy Keys, who are both off on their own. It's not like Laurie has these early run-ins with Michael where he almost kills her and then they clash repeatedly throughout the film. She doesn't realize that something's been going around terrorizing Haddonfield till near the very end, which is actually impressive on Carpenter's end because this face-off between Laurie and Michael is one of the more famous confrontations in a horror movie, with the scene of her desperately trying to get back into Tommy Doyle's house being probably one of the most intense moments in the entire film. But this whole face-off between Laurie and Michael only comprises a small part of the movie, even though it feels like it's much longer, but in a good way because so much happens in such a short period of time. Now, while Jamie Lee Curtis is great here and Laurie Strode's gone on to become one of the most integral characters to this franchise, I'd argue that's not necessarily the case here. With that simplistic but effective nature of the storytelling, Laurie, as seen here, is more just this innocent girl who's on her own, just babysitting for much of the film before her life gets upended by the appearance of Michael in the quickest and most abrupt way. And we don't exactly learn a ton about her, especially since the movie quickly ends after she's saved by Dr. Loomis. There are things revealed in the sequels, like the two of them being siblings, then that gets retconned, and then she becomes this badass all these years later in the 2018 films, but that's not who the character is here. While Curtis is great, Laurie's characterization here is considerably more bare bones, as someone who just happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Though it's worth noting that the minimal characterization fits with what Carpenter was looking to go for here in general, something just completely stripped down and to the point. In this movie, I'd argue the more emotional core comes from Dr. Loomis, played by Donald Pleasance, who I'd say is just as important of a character to this franchise as Laurie is. Here, Loomis is the one with the personal connection to Michael, having been his psychiatrist, trying to treat him, and then realizing that he's nothing more than pure evil and must be stopped. His characterization is only a step above Laurie's here, as he mainly acts as this sagely figure who just explains Michael's motivations or lack thereof, and is always just seen being one step behind Michael for much of the film, never really crossing paths with Laurie till the end where he saves her. So even when I say he's the film's emotional core, I still say that a little loosely, as he's mainly just there to provide the necessary information. But still, he serves as some personal tie to our antagonist, and that does help make the film a little more compelling. And it should go without saying, but Donald Pleasance is great here as well, approaching each scene with a collected calm, with almost this presence of a bounty hunter about him for the way he's so determined to track Michael down. I don't have many criticism beyond what I already mentioned earlier regarding the characterization, which itself is something of a minor nitpick. The only other thing I'd really say is that the acting at some points could be a little better, and some of the dialogue can feel a little clunky here and there. Some of the line deliveries were a little off, and I know you don't go to slasher movies for Oscar-worthy performances or anything like that, but you expect something that comes off as passable, and there were just a few lines that could have been written better or were written fine and just came off as wooden, with Nancy Kyes as Annie probably being the biggest offender of this, and sometimes it's a little distracting from time to time. But I also understand it's a product of its time. It was a low-budget film at $300,000, which is definitely low by even 1978 standards, and it was common in a lot of more auteur films at the time, where things would be a bit rough around the edges in one way or another, since they only had so much to work with. Not all the time, but unlike a lot of lower budget independent films now, films of a smaller nature in the 70s had imperfections on either a technical or acting level that tend to show, usually due to time constraints or budget constraints or whatever it was. It could also just be that it was the 70s and some dialogue landed better then than it does now. So I don't hold that as a huge strike against this or anything, it's just that it was a little noticeable. And one other thing that's not so much of a criticism but is worth pointing out, but this is the film that laid the groundwork for many of the famous horror cliches, like having sex equaling death or the killer walking calmly towards his victims, among many other things. Now, if you saw this early on in your horror movie days, like I did, you may not think much of this. But if you watched a lot of other horror movies prior to watching this, like if you watched this much later on, you may see it as nothing more than being full of cliches, and you might not see what all the hype's about. And I can see some people not necessarily being so impressed because they feel they could predict where this was going. But keep in mind, this is the one that started it all, so it does get a pass for doing what's now just become known as tropes of the genre. Plus, besides, a lot of the technical achievements greatly make up for that anyway. Halloween is an iconic horror movie and still holds up well today as a classic. Unlike many of the films it would go on to inspire, it operated on a less is more approach, and it excelled because of it, thanks especially to Carpenter's direction and score really bringing about such an eerie sense of dread. Add to that a trio of iconic characters in Michael Myers, Laurie Strode, and Dr. Loomis, all of whom made a huge impact, and you have one of the biggest game changers in the horror genre, and one that's still entertaining and terrifying to this day. Halloween gets a 9 out of 10. So, next month will be my review of the first of many, many sequels, Halloween 2. But until then, let me know, did you see Halloween, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Is this one of your favorite slasher movies? Is it one of your favorite John Carpenter movies? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.